As the founder and CEO of the Bail Project, Robin Steinberg has created a revolving fund that provides free bail assistance to low-income individuals. Joining us now to tell us more is Robin, and we're so excited to have you here, Robin, and to hear more about your work. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being here. When I started my career, I don't know exactly what I was expecting. I'm sure that it definitely involved marble columns and vast, beautiful courtrooms and brilliant legal arguments delivered by caring, eloquent advocates and justice being dispensed by judges with Solomon-like wisdom, compassion, and righteousness. But then I stepped foot into my first criminal courthouse in New York City. It was the 1980s and the so-called get tough on crime years. The war on drugs was in full swing. Police departments were expanding and militarizing. Mandatory minimum sentences were all the rage. And the public made very clear that anyone who appeared soft on crime would pay the electoral price. The media, pundits, and the politicians on the left and the right referred to young people of color as super predators and women who just needed social service support as welfare queens. It seemed as if America couldn't lock people up fast enough. We were well on our way to incarcerating more people than any other country in the world. As I approached that courthouse that first time, I saw a bus pull up alongside the building, and it began to unload men and women who were chained together, leading them into a small door on the side of the building where they just disappeared. It was a disconcerting sight. And inside, the courthouse was no better. The hallways were lined with people and families and children, most of them Black and Latinx, waiting anxiously for the courtroom doors to open. And once those doors opened, there was a frenetic, desperate energy that filled the air as family members poured into those dark courtrooms, each that had large, filthy windows, flickering fluorescent lights overhead, and those famous New York City pigeons who somehow had found their ways into the courtroom, up onto the rafters, and literally had a bird's eye view of the proceedings below. As names were called out, the accused would be led into the courtroom in handcuffs, flanked on both sides by court officers. Family members would strain to see their loved ones, and they would sneak a wave or share a smile, and there were tears. There were so many tears. Each court proceeding lasted barely a minute. Charges were read out loud. The accused stood silently as judges and prosecutors and defense lawyers convened up at the bench. Sometimes there were short, cursory arguments made about bail, but more often there were discussions about convenient court dates for the parties. And I quickly understood that that was the embodiment of what had come to pass for justice in America. It turns out that my dreams about marble and morality and justice were a little bit like expecting a romance in the middle of a horror movie. And I suppose after that first day, I could have just walked away, vowing never to be part of a criminal legal system that was so dehumanizing and so cruel. But instead, what I saw actually convinced me that that was exactly where I needed to be. So I became a public defender and I threw myself headlong into the system. For years and decades, late at night, I would lay awake in my bed trying to come to terms with what I saw every day. A legal system that tore families apart, that inflicted punishment with seemingly no mercy, and administered justice based on the size of a person's bank account and all too often the color of their skin. It was a system that gutted our most fundamental legal principle, that all people were entitled to equal justice under the law. And nowhere was that more apparent to me than when cash bail was set. Watching my clients get hauled off into a jail cell before they'd been convicted of anything, solely because they didn't have enough money in their bank account to pay for their price of their freedom, made me furious, because it all came down to money. Bail, by definition, was supposed to be a form of conditional release. It was a really simple idea. If you make people put some money on the line, they'll have a financial incentive to come back to court until their case is resolved. But that theory depends on bail amounts being set in an amount that people can actually afford. So determining what people can afford requires an individualized assessment of financial ability to pay. Now remember, the Federal Reserve in this country recently reported that 4 in 10 Americans lack enough savings to cover a $400 emergency. So bail schedules and even minute-long first appearances in court before a judge result in cash bail amounts being set with little or no regard for one's actual ability to pay. Bails are simply too high for people to pay. This has morphed bail from being what was supposed to be a form of release to becoming the leading driver of incarceration in America, affecting 2.5 million people every year who are disproportionately from communities of color. And it has earned America the dubious distinction of being the #1 incarcerator in the world. Being held in jail on bail creates a cascade of problems, and they all build on each other. It does obvious physical and mental harm to the person in jail, but we also know that the pretrial detention will strongly tie itself to negative case outcomes. Those who were held in jail pretrial are more likely to plead guilty, whether they did it or not, to get home to safety, to protect their jobs, their homes, their education, their families. Those held in jail pretrial are 4 times more likely to receive a jail sentence than peers charged with the same thing who were released pretrial, and those jail sentences are going to be 3 times longer. And for women held in the pretrial detention system, the damage is borne by their children. Children with incarcerated moms are 5 times more likely to end up in foster care than those with incarcerated dads. And of course, this comes at an enormous cost, not only to the people and families directly impacted, but to the American taxpayers, who spend $14 billion every year to jail people who have not been convicted of a crime. And when you take into account the collateral costs and the costs of the system to run, it could be as high as $140 billion every year. We would be wise to remember those figures when we are struggling to find money to fund education or housing or healthcare. And like every single aspect of our criminal legal system, policing, prosecutorial charging decisions, bail, sentencing, prison discipline, reentry, probation, and parole, racial disparities are ever present and stunning. If cash bail is set and you are Black or brown, you are 2 times more likely to remain in a jail cell than your white counterpart. 50% of the people incarcerated in this country before conviction are Black and brown. Our local jails in this country are filled with people who have not yet been convicted of a crime, have not had their day in court, and have not had their trial. People awaiting trial make up over 60% of jail populations nationally. In some of the cities where the Bail Project is operating, that figure is upwards of 90%. But you may be wondering, maybe it's all worth it. Maybe jail works. Maybe it's worth it because it makes us safer. Here's the thing. If mass incarceration worked, we would be the safest country in the world. And we're not. What we are seeing are the consequences of our tragic belief that incarceration is the answer to every social problem. And that belief led us not only to a legal crisis where our basic due process rights routinely go up for sale in the form of cash bail, but also to a humanitarian crisis that impacts millions of people every year and devastates families for generations. So ending cash bail and the 2-tier system of justice that it creates is one of the defining civil rights and racial justice issues of our time. After all these years visiting people in jail, I'm still shocked when I go behind those bars and those walls at what I see. And every time I step foot in a criminal courthouse, I'm still stunned by how little has changed since I first walked through those doors all those years ago. So after 3 decades as a public defender, I decided to create an organization capable of taking direct aim at the front door of mass incarceration, the cash bail system. In January of 2018, we launched the Bail Project. The Bail Project is a national not-for-profit organization that provides free bail assistance to thousands of low-income Americans every year while working to eliminate cash bail and create a more humane and equitable pretrial system. The Bail Project has 2 critical components. First, we have built a national revolving bail fund that is now powered by nearly 500,000 supporters across the country. This Freedom Fund provides an immediate lifeline to people who would otherwise sit in those jail cells while presumed innocent just because they can't pay bail. To date, we have done over 14,000 bailouts in 24 different locations across the country and paid over $32 million in bail money from our national revolving bail fund. Our clients return to over 90% of their court dates. And because cash bail is returned at the end of a criminal case, if you come back to court and make your appearances, we're able to recycle those same dollars and help even more people, maximizing the impact of every single dollar and every single contribution. Anywhere from 20 to 60% of cases are dismissed entirely once we pay bail, demonstrating that freedom can make all the difference in one's legal defense. At the Bail Project, we see each one of those bailouts as an act of resistance against a system that is riddled with unfairness and systemic racism. The second critical component of the bail project is our modeled pretrial support, a model that we propose is a viable alternative to cash bail. We call this model community release with support. It is used by our local teams across the country to support people upon release. The model consists of conducting individualized needs assessments to determine what type of services or supports, if any, a client needs upon her release. Our local teams use this information to connect our clients to community resources and social services, in addition to providing effective court reminders and transportation assistance so people can get back to court. Whether it's housing or food or drug treatment or mental health services, screening for needs helps us better understand if we can effectively support the client once back in the community. With our partners on the ground, we're demonstrating that it is possible to take cash bail out of the pretrial equation, save billions of taxpayer dollars, reimagine our justice system, and free future generations from our dependence on jails. We've taken this decarceration strategy to high-need jurisdictions across the country, and as we scale, we are building out a national portfolio to better understand what works in unique jurisdictions and environments and what doesn't. We're collecting a national data set, refining best practices for pretrial support, and telling the human stories of the impacts of cash bail to arm advocates and policymakers and local elected officials with the knowledge and data they need to work towards reform that will ensure long-term systemic change. But I really want to be crystal clear about something. Our long-term goal is to end the need for bail funds and put ourselves out of business, one jurisdiction at a time. While the bail fund is a powerful tool, it's a vehicle to address human suffering right now and catalyzes reform, but it is not an end in and of itself. If we want to end mass incarceration and create a justice system that works for everybody, eliminating our current cash bail system is going to be a necessary first step. Right now, there's enormous potential for reform. But if we're not careful, if we're not vigilant and thoughtful and analytic, we run the risk of recreating the racial and economic inequalities of our current system in a different form, even after we end cash bail, because systems do not go down without a fight. Replacing cash bail with electronic monitoring, so-called risk algorithms, probation-like supervision or surveillance for those who have been accused but not convicted of a crime can also lead to unequal treatment, racial disparities, injustice, and more incarceration. But it is possible to create a better system, one that treats everyone fairly and with dignity, regardless of economic status, race, or background. The events of the past 6 months, including the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and the uprisings across this country that followed, expose yet again how deeply entrenched racial injustice is in our criminal legal system. We have a lot of work to do. And while we see some movement, criminal justice reform isn't sweeping the nation. And conversations about bail reform specifically become incredibly complicated and divisive. So what's stopping us from moving forward? What's getting in our way? Well, I think it's because we focus on the wrong thing. Rather than dive into the facts and have rational conversations about criminal justice, our minds drift to the rare or the hypothetical, the unforgivable, and the scary. I don't know, maybe that's human nature. Maybe it's the result of a narrative of fear that has paved the way to mass incarceration and has carefully been burnished for decades to justify the worst excesses in our criminal legal system. Maybe it's because there are deeply entrenched economic interests in maintaining the criminal legal system at its current size, or maybe we just watch too much Law and Order and Criminal Minds on television and it's made us all afraid. But whatever it is, it takes us down a particular path. Rather than look at what usually happens or what most people do, we wind up creating systems designed to protect us against the scary thing, but the thing that rarely happens. In other words, we wind up legislating around the exception. And focusing on the exception, on the rare and scary things, leads us to justify horrible things. The death penalty, solitary confinement, dehumanizing jail conditions, just to name a few. So let's not do that. Let's talk about the things we know, not the things we fear. We know that holding someone in jail pre-trial makes them more likely to commit a crime when they get out than if they had been free all along. And we know that holding someone in jail pre-trial has devastating short and long-term consequences, not just for the person in jail, but for her family and her community. But we know more than that. In the few places where statewide bail reform has taken hold, New York and New Jersey to name two, not only have thousands and thousands of people gotten out of jail, they've done so without any aggregate negative impact on public safety. Have there been isolated incidents of people being released and then while out committing a terrible crime? Yes, of course. And those instances are always heartbreaking, and they lead us to question ourselves, and they might even justify reflection. But they should not lead us to reverse course. Despite the fact that they can and will be used by the opponents of reform and those who profit from the status quo to frighten the public and intimidate politicians, we have to see those efforts for exactly what they are. They're the age-old formula of fear-mongering that focuses on the outlier in order to poison otherwise solid policy advances. We cannot allow these moments and inevitable backlash that follows to stop progress. We cannot let ourselves be drawn into that fear. For elected officials, that challenge is going to be the hardest because pressure will mount and the chorus of voices demanding you do something, anything, are going to get really loud. But these are the moments to remain vigilant and honest and steadfast and courageous. Because when the emotional reactions pass and rational thought returns, we can ground our thinking in what usually happens, not what rarely happens, and remind ourselves of the myriad injustices that happen in our criminal legal system every day and in our jails and prisons every night. Those injustices are the shameful norm, not the outliers. And that's what we need to be focusing on. So there is momentum for change in our criminal legal system, and the winds may even be at our backs. But what do we do next? Where can we have the most impact? What matters the most? Well, I have to be honest, these questions have guided and haunted me for most of my career. I thought the answer at first was to become a public defender, but once I saw the limitations of traditional defense, I became convinced there was a better way to deliver public defense. So I worked to develop new models of public defense. Then I realized we were failing to recognize the unique needs of women. So I worked to develop the only public defender office in the nation dedicated exclusively to the representation of women, called Still She Rises in Oklahoma. I thought specialization might be the answer. But then I watched woman after woman stuck behind bars, no matter how hard her brilliant advocates fought, simply because she didn't have enough money to pay her bail. So I launched the Bail Project because disrupting the cash bail system had to be the solution. After all, if we can prevent incarceration before it begins, isn't that the answer? For almost 4 decades, I've been seeking the answer, frantically creating one project after the next, jumpstarting one initiative after the other, teaching, writing, speaking, all in the quest to find the place of the most impact, the answer. The project that's going to fundamentally change the way our criminal legal system operates so that those young dreams of justice that I carried with me on that very first day I stepped into that criminal courtroom as a public defender can finally become reality. And it has been a long journey. You know, there aren't a lot of good things to say about the aging process. Your hair turns really white, your knees hurt, and sometimes you find your cell phone in a freezer inexplicably. But the good thing that comes from age is wisdom. Wisdom that grows with experience. Wisdom that comes from remembering that social justice and racial justice work went on before us and will continue long after we're gone. Wisdom that springs from having seen progress race forward only to see it later step back. And the wisdom to know that if I'm working on a problem that I can solve in my lifetime, I'm not thinking big enough. Wisdom has taught me actually that there's no one strategy. It's going to take every strategy imaginable because our criminal legal system is a tapestry of tragedy and failure. And while every thread you pull brings us a little closer to unraveling the whole thing, the interconnectedness of the policies and the vast financial interests make the entire system shockingly resilient. So no matter how hard we fight, how brilliant our solutions seem, we're going to recreate the same systems over and over again if we do not dig deeper. But to do that, we first have to reckon with what we've done as a nation. We have to acknowledge the things we know deep in our hearts, but that we're too ashamed to say out loud. That we turned our backs on some of the most pressing social issues of our times: addiction, mental illness, structural racism, poverty, violence, and trauma, and we use patrol cars and handcuffs and cold, damp jail cells instead. That we marginalize those who are most vulnerable in our society, and then we criminalize them, from the immigrant father who crosses the border just to find a better life for his family, to the mom forced to sleep under a bridge because she can't make ends meet. And rather than investing in low-income communities of color and repairing the harm of centuries of racial injustice, we targeted them and unleashed the power of the criminal legal system to take away not just their freedom, but also appropriate the few financial resources they had by imposing unconscionable fines and fees and bail. We have to reckon with that shameful legacy. And even that painful process isn't going to be enough. We have to go deeper and confront our own deeply held beliefs about justice and crime and punishment. We have to recognize that the systems of jails and prisons that we've created were not designed to rehabilitate, not designed to keep us safe, but to try to break the human spirit. And this reduces all of us because these harms, they're being done in all of our names. Injustice dehumanizes everyone it touches, from the victims to the enforcers to the spectators, to all of us. So our unforgiving stance must give way to the recognition that we're all complicit here, complicit in the poverty, in the violence of poverty and inequality. We're complicit in the violence of incarceration. We're complicit in the violence of indifference, which in the face of suffering will erode our shared humanity. Recognizing that simple and painful truth can help us pave a way to a new justice by calling ourselves to account and rising to the demand of this moment in our nation's history. I've come to realize that while policy changes are vitally important and can change systems in the short term, they will not last until we do the real work of transforming ourselves. And that begins when we no longer desire retribution, but instead we seek justice. When we no longer desire vengeance, but we practice compassion. When we no longer desire harm, but recognize instead that hurt people, and dedicate ourselves to healing and restoration. And it begins and can only end when we can finally see in the faces of those ensnared and imprisoned in our criminal legal system ourselves, and when we see our children in their children. The criminal legal system is not malfunctioning. It's working exactly as it was intended to and as it has always been, as a tool to criminalize the poor, people of color, and create the other. Worse, it cements the status quo of power and privilege in America. We need an entire system reset, one that completely rethinks how we judge, how we punish, and how we police. A reset that can not only transform our current policies, but can create a new path for us to rediscover our common humanity. And we can start with cash bail.
Robin, what an incredible ride you've had, taking a sort of front seat to the injustice that begins and really rests on cash bail as a perpetuator of a two-tier justice system when it ought to be one. I love that you said systems don't go down without a fight. And I'm deeply appreciative for the fight that you've undertaken and the way you're galvanizing us all to help you. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. I want to ask a quick question from our audience. This person asked if you've had difficulty convincing politicians, and perhaps like how have you tried to engage politicians in the cause of ending cash bail, and what have you faced there?
Sure. So when we think about change, we think about changing hearts and changing minds. And for some people, we can work with local elected officials and provide them with the data that really shows if you just presume people can be released and provide them with the supports they need and effective court reminders, they're going to come back to court. They're going to thrive. They can go back to their jobs and their families and their communities, and they will continue to return to court until their cases are resolved. That is an enormous financial saving for some jurisdictions. And so for some jurisdictions, it's going to be money that's going to, encourage them to make change. For other people, it's going to be justice. For other people, it's going to be the, obvious injustice and unfairness of the cash bail system and how it allows somebody with money to get out with somebody charged with the same crime, not to get out simply because they don't have enough money in their bank account. So I think, both strategies have to operate. It's why we're collecting a national data set so we can provide that to local elected officials to show that people will come back to court. You can do this in a more fair way. You can save money in your local jurisdictions by doing it. Obviously, that's not what motivates us, but that will motivate some politicians. And then you change hearts by elevating the stories of those most impacted by the criminal legal system and allowing them to speak for themselves. You ensure that they're involved in the process. When we think about everything we do with the Bail Project, we engage folks who have been impacted personally by the legal system or have lived experience themselves, both internally in our organization, but also externally in this fight for ending cash bail in this country. But ending cash bail and making sure that what we create after it, right, doesn't recreate the same injustice.
Thank you so much. Your command of systemic change is really, really inspiring. And so we were so lucky to have you here tonight. Really appreciate you joining, Robin. Thank you.